In the 1960s, two of the most powerful men in the world were the President of the United States of America and the Prime Minister and Communist Party leader of the Soviet Union. In the autumn of 1962, they clashed over a Caribbean island near the United States and brought the world closer to nuclear war than at any time since 1945. The island was called Cuba. Until 1959, its capital, Havana, was the center of a military dictatorship under President Batista. He'd come to power in 1952. At first, he'd promised reform, but his government ruled by force and became corrupt. Cuba, known throughout the New World as the rich Americans' playground, was tailored to their needs and tastes. United States influence didn't end on the nightclub floor. It was the dominant fact of Cuban life. American investment was huge, giving them great influence and power. They owned the banks and many of the larger farms too. Yet in the countryside, Cuba's peasants were without land, lacked machinery, and lived in poverty. The economy relied on sugar. Only if the crop was good and world sugar prices high could Cuba do relatively well. The biggest symbol of American influence was at Guantanamo Bay, a huge air and naval base leased for 99 years. By the late 1950s, Batista had become increasingly harsh. His opponents were dealt with ruthlessly. Then, in December 1956, a few anti-Batista revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro landed in Cuba. It was a disaster. Most were destroyed by Batista's forces, but a few managed to escape to the Sierra Maestra Mountains, remote, inaccessible, and safe. Here, Castro began to build a revolutionary base. He persuaded many villagers to support him and educated them in his political aims. His guerrillas improved their skills, and his support grew. By 1958, his hard core of only 300 men was enough to resist a major attempt by the Cuban army to destroy him. After this, Batista's defeat was only a matter of time. It came in January 1959. Castro's victory procession in Havana must have seemed like a fairy tale come true. Batista's army and government had been overthrown within 2 years. Castro was only 32. He seemed to sum up a new hope. One of his first steps was to punish those guilty of atrocities under Batista. It was obvious that the accused were going to be found guilty, and most of them probably were. Castro also looked forward to economic independence and demanded the end of foreign exploitation. Throughout the year, private companies, mainly foreign-owned, were taken over. As nationalization of these companies increased, so Americans were advised by their embassy to leave. Finally, the American ambassador himself went in October, leaving his gleaming white embassy in Havana empty. The economic relationship on which Cuba had relied, for good or ill, for 100 years had been broken. That way of life was finished. Sugar, the mainstay of Cuba's economy, was no longer being bought by the Americans. Who was going to take their place? The Russians. In February 1960, Mr. Mikoyan, the Soviet vice premier, visited Havana and signed a huge economic agreement. Russia would buy 1 million tons of sugar a year and give Cuba a large loan for 12 years. Nothing could have marked Cuba's political shift away from America more dramatically. The island was already a political issue there, and one that was to dog the new American president in Washington from the day of his inauguration.